In this lecture, I will be talking a little bit about the development of the English language. You might be thinking, why do I need to know about the history of the English language in order to learn medical and scientific terminology? And it helps to understand a little bit of the history of the language to understand the extent to which, in particular, Greek and Latin, but also other languages, have had an impact on the development of our vocabulary. And so this lecture will hopefully briefly orient you to the history of the language and help you to understand how it developed, how vocabulary was added, and how we got to where we are today. All right, so first, the English language. English has a really large vocabulary that is constantly changing. We can divide this vocabulary into two groups. There's a core vocabulary that most people share, and then there's our learned vocabulary. So depending on your major, you probably have different learned vocabulary. As a historian, I have a particular set of learned vocabulary. In this particular class, we're working on a very particular set of learned vocabulary, that of the medical and scientific fields. If you are a psychology major, there's a specific learned vocabulary. So depending on your major, your profession, sort of where you fall in that spectrum, you're going to learn different vocabulary. Believe it or not, over 60% of our words trace back in some fashion to Greek or Latin roots. And when we look at medical and scientific language, that percentage goes up to over 90%. So that is why classes like these exist, which teach medical terminology by helping you to learn Greek and Latin words and then to apply that to understanding medical terminology. They exist because such a large proportion of our medical terminology is derived from Greek and Latin words. And words enter our language roughly in one of two ways. So first, we can borrow words. And there are lots of different ways we can borrow words, but we'll just call it borrowing. And second is that we can create words. So words enter the language either from being borrowed from somewhere else or from being created wholesale. All right, so English is part of the Indo-European language family, which you see a map here illustrating the early distribution of Indo-European languages. There are as many as 600 unrelated language families. Indo-European is only one of those, although it is a fairly influential language family, I guess we could say. But it is indeed only one of many. The name Indo-European derives from the geographical range over which these languages were spoken before they were spread to the New World. So, as you can see on the map here, Indo-European languages ranged from the Indian subcontinent. You can see we have IndoEuropean to the north in sort of the Eurasian steppe. We've got Iranian, Tacharian, and all the way through Europe. And in fact, most languages in Europe trace back to a common ancestor. A note about the term Indo-European. This is strictly a historical term. Clearly, these languages have spread beyond India and Europe. Case in point, English, which we speak in the United States, it's still Indo-European. But we use the term Indo-European to refer to them. Also, it's important to note that while many European languages trace back to a common ancestor, not all European languages are Indo-European in origin. Indo-European is among the most studied of all language families. And here we see the Indo-European family tree, or honestly a highly simplified version of it. If you Google Indo-European family tree, you will find many graphs which will make your head spin. But so you can see here, we've got a series of sort of daughter languages: Indian, Armenian, Iranian, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Albanian, Celtic, Hellenic, Italic. You can see English down here. If you trace that green line, English is actually from the Germanic branch of the Indo-European family tree. And so we are going to talk briefly a little bit about 4 of the branches that are especially important for the development of English. Hellenic, or Greek, Celtic, Italic, and Germanic. All right, so Celtic. I'm going to go back to that map for a minute. So you can see here, Celtic, that Celtic languages once spread over most of Europe, and they were used especially in coastal areas and also in the British Isles. Hellenic, in other words, Greek. The Greeks called themselves the Hellenes. They are the Hellenic civilization. So Greek rivals Latin as a source of influence on the English vocabulary. And we get ancient Greek vocabulary both directly and also borrowed indirectly through Latin, because Latin itself had a great deal of interaction with ancient Greek. And the influence of ancient Greek is almost entirely through higher education and scholarship, especially the life sciences. So when scholars were looking for words to use for that learned vocabulary, they looked to ancient Greek as well as to Latin. And in fact, as we'll talk about a little bit later, for many centuries, Latin was the language of scholarship. We also have the Italic daughter family. And the Italic daughter languages have had the most pervasive and lasting effect on the composition of the English vocabulary. This, of course, goes back to Latin. Latin was the language of ancient Rome, spread throughout Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor by Roman conquests. And the economic, military, and cultural success made Latin dominant. And in fact, it became so dominant that it pretty much swamped all of the other Italic languages, as well as non-Indo-European languages, and became the dominant language throughout the region encompassed by the Roman Empire. Today, this is what we call a living dead language. That sounds like an oxymoron. I think that is an oxymoron, honestly. When we talk about a language being dead, we don't mean that we can't read it, but we mean that it's no longer being used by a group of people every day. As we'll talk about a little bit later, languages are living things. They continue to evolve. They are constantly changing. And Latin is not used by anybody as their sort of day-to-day language, but it does continue to be used by the Roman Catholic Church in liturgy and in other communications. And so in that sense, it's still alive, although it's not changing in the sense that it might. So it is a living dead language. And so modern Italic languages, also known as Romance languages, are pretty much what Latin became in different parts of the Roman Empire. So in Italy, Latin became Italian. In Spain, Latin became Spanish. In France, Latin became French. And so this is part of the explanation for, of course, the similarities between these languages. If you've taken classes in more than one of them, you'll know just how many similarities there are. I studied abroad in Rome, and I knew no Italian when I went to Rome. I knew no Latin when I went to Rome. I was told everybody spoke English. That was false. That was really false. I took French in middle school and high school, so I had a decent grasp on French. And I quickly learned, once I got to Rome, that if I could say something in French, if I switched out the endings in the articles for Italian endings and articles and gave it an Italian accent, I could actually be understood, which was pretty interesting. It completely butchered my French. I don't know that I would really recommend it. Okay, and so finally we have Germanic. So Germanic is the closest relative of English in the Indo-European family. As we saw on the family tree last slide, technically English is on the Germanic branch. Now, Germanic is not the same as German. So German is also on the Germanic branch, but not the same as German. English comes from, here, let's go back to that family tree. English comes from, you can see, the Low Germanic branch. And the Low Germanic branch are Germanic languages of the flat lowlands of northern Germany, the Netherlands, and their descendants. All right, so a brief history of the English language. All right, so English was first spoken in Great Britain in the mid-5th century CE. So we're just going to kind of take an overview, 2,000 years of history in, 15 minutes? Let's see how I do. You can time me. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the existing linguistic influences in England before the development of English. Then we have Old English, Middle English, Early Modern English, and Modern English. You can see we have this lovely map, which shows pretty much England at the time of the Roman occupation. All right, so the first Indo-European occupants of Britain were the Celts. Britain was then conquered by the Romans and permanently occupied from the mid-1st century CE. By about 400 CE, when they were experiencing pressure from Germanic peoples across the empire, the Romans pulled out of Britain. The Celts, then, no longer having the protection of the Romans, invited Germanic mercenary soldiers from Europe to come and protect them. And these mercenaries came from 3 tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And these Germanic tribes did come. They said, sure, and then they effectively invaded England and pushed the Celtic-speaking peoples out of the central areas of the island, effectively isolating them, bringing with them their language, which sort of mixed with the existing influences and can be identified as English back to the central part of the mid-5th century. We don't have any actual written English until the first quarter of the 8th century CE, but we're pretty sure that we can trace the usage of the language back to the mid-5th century. And so actually the words English in England come from the name of the tribe of the Angles. So Angle-ish English and Angle-land. Of course, often when we talk about these people, I don't know, the Jutes, like they lost their billing altogether. We talk about the Anglo-Saxons. And so here you can see on this map that we have these 3 different groups of people all coming into England. All right, so Old English from 450 to 1066. Old English is also called Anglo-Saxon. It seems to have had about 25 to 30,000 words, which were mostly homogeneous in origin. Contacts with other peoples did bring in some foreign words, in particular contacts with Celtic languages, Latin languages, the Latin language, and Scandinavian languages. There was not a whole lot of contact with Celtic peoples who had inhabited Britain prior to the Germanic invasions because they had been pushed to isolated areas. In terms of Latin, there were 2 main sources of Latin words. First, there were Latin words that had come into the Anglo-Saxon language before invading England. So the Angles and the Saxons had interacted with Latin-speaking people and borrowed words in that way. And second, in the late 6th and early 7th century CE, the Anglo-Saxons adopted Christianity, and Latin was the language of the church. And so this was a very significant early influence. We also see the influence of another language from the Germanic family tree, Scandinavian, because England had to deal with the Viking invasions from the 8th through 11th century. And here on this map, you see the Viking invasions being illustrated. The Vikings probably spoke Old Norse, which was another Germanic language, and there was probably a considerable degree of mutual intelligibility between Old English and Old Norse. And the current inhabitants surrendered to the invaders, who eventually established the Danelaw in 818, which is largely that red area shown there. Almost all of these Vikings who came and who settled were men, and so it seems that intermarriage with the local population must have been fairly common, because otherwise they would have died out. So 1066. 1066 is one of my favorite years in all of history. I'm really not quite sure why I like the Norman invasion of England so much, but it's just cool. So Middle English dates from 1066 to 1476, and of course 1066 is the date of the Norman conquest of Britain. And the Norman conquest of Britain was an event that was to herald great changes for the English language. Because the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced by a new group of Norman elites. And if you look at this map, you will see that Normandy is in France. So William and his followers spoke French. And so this introduced a new correlation between social standing and language, because the peasants spoke English and the overlords spoke French. It does not seem that widespread bilingualism developed as a result of the invasion, but they must have learned enough to communicate with one another. You know, you wanted to be able to give orders to your serfs, to have them obey your commands. And eventually the Normans in England assimilated to the English-speaking majority. So even though they were the invaders, they eventually came to speak English themselves. And this interaction resulted in dramatic vocabulary changes due to the influence of French. Now, it's important to note that the French spoken by the Normans was a provincial dialect, different from that spoken around Paris, which is not marked on our map, but is more kind of in the center of France. Also, the Normans themselves were only a few generations removed from the Vikings. They were known as the Northmen, and they had been, I believe, asked to come settle in Normandy to protect it from the Vikings, from other Vikings. So the Normans have, shall we say, probably some common ancestry with the Germanic population that was already in England. And the influence of French grew through the 13th century onward, in part through French-English political contacts. England had substantial landholdings in France until 1204, and also through the cultural prestige of French in Europe. In 1204, the French king took Normandy from England, and from this point forward, the English kings no longer had substantial holdings in France. And so their interaction with France shifted from Normandy to Paris. And so it was the French spoken around Paris that became influential, rather than that provincial dialect spoken around Normandy. And many of the loanwords that enter at this point can be traced back to Greek and Latin. After the 14th century in England, English became the dominant language of administration, commerce, art, and learning. And we see a decline at the rate of which common words were adopted from any foreign source. However, during this period, vocabulary had changed rapidly, making English into what we might call a hybrid language. And in fact, some French words had already become such an inseparable part of the English language that they could now combine with other borrowed words or with English words to produce new compounds. All right, early modern English. All right, so early modern English, this period, 1476 to 1776, overlaps substantially with the chronological boundaries of the Renaissance, which is, of course, the rebirth of antiquity, of classical learning. However, the cultural aftermath of the Renaissance continued beyond the political events of the 17th century. And the revival of classical learning had a power and permanent effect on the intellectual life of the following century. So, two events during the 15th century had significant effects on the English language, signaling a shift from what we call Middle to early modern English. The first of these was the printing press, dated to 1476, and this marks a turning point in the production and accessibility of books. Before this, the way that books were copied was by hand. Imagine sitting and making a copy of our textbook by hand. How many hours would that take? So then take how many hours that would take and give yourself a reasonable living wage. Remember, if you're copying books, you're part of the elite. There aren't that many people who know how to read, so we're not talking minimum wage. And then multiply that and you'll have the cost of your textbook. I don't know how many of us could afford that. So the printing press, where now we could easily make hundreds and thousands of copies of a book. This was a really big deal, and it marks a turning point in the production and accessibility of books. And as books become more abundant, as they're more easily produced, their cost to produce is going to go down. As cost goes down, they are going to be easier to access for most people. So, in other words, literacy will no longer be restricted to the elite. And so the main cultural difference between Middle and early modern English is the number of people who had access to books and who could read. In fact, it's estimated that during the period of Middle English, there was probably about 2% literacy. And in the early modern period, this rose to 50 to 60% literacy, which is really incredible if you think about it. And of course, the rise of literacy led to the rapid expansion of the vocabulary. The other significant event is, of course, the discovery of the New World in 1492. The end of early modern English is also marked by two events during the 18th century. So first, in 1755, we have the appearance of the Dictionary of the English Language by Samuel Johnson, and this was the first really influential dictionary of English. And also, of course, the American Revolution in 1776 and all that. During this period, during this 300-year period from 1476 to 1776, the importance of French loanwords declined, and English turned increasingly to Greek and Latin for new learned words. So, scholars felt that English should be able to express the full range of abstract ideas and subtle emotions conveyed in classical writings. And so they had to find words to express those ideas. In addition, knowing Latin and Greek was pretty much a requirement to be considered an educated person. Latin was the language of academic scholarship. And an interest in translating classical texts also led to the introduction of new words, as they found that they didn't have the words to translate the text into English. So, for example, in translating the work of Diodorus Siculus, 800 new Latin words were introduced into the English language, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. During this period, many English speakers were also exposed to the customs and language of other Europeans, as they were able to travel more broadly than before, and we see more and more interactions. We see more and more trade during this period. And so we see the beginning of a trend that continues today, where we welcome words from any contemporary language, and not just, sort of the prestigious languages of Greek and Latin. Although during this period, Greek and Latin words were borrowed at a much higher rate. However, we see words that were borrowed from Italian, from Dutch, from Spanish, from Portuguese, so from many other languages. And towards the end of the 18th century, the balance changed in favor of borrowing words from the living languages of travel and commerce. So modern English. English has developed a rich and varied vocabulary, both in terms of the number of items and the sources. So the vocabulary of Old English was largely homogeneous, but the cultural changes following the Norman conquest created conditions for the development of a heterogeneous vocabulary. We all encounter foreign words in the English language on a regular basis. Many of them we may not realize that they're foreign, but some of them we do recognize as foreign. In fact, only 1/3 of the first 10,000 words that we learn are native. In other words, Germanic words that have been in continuous use since Old English times. So in other words, about 2/3 of that first 10,000 words are borrowed words from other languages. So our vocabulary is very heterogeneous in terms of sources, but those sources largely all come from within the Indo-European language family. So it's still at the same time somewhat homogeneous, and that only 2% of our words sort of come from those other language families, those other 599 language families. And in trying to think about what picture to illustrate this, I chose a picture from, of course, the new Independence Day movie, because I felt like it represented, peoples from around the world coming together and interacting and presumably affecting each other's language. All right, so let's wrap up with some notes about language. First, languages are living things. They constantly renew themselves. Unnecessary words are discarded. New words are created or borrowed. And if you think about it, I'm sure you can see this happening within your lifetime. I know if I think about it, I can see it happening within my lifetime. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I thought a little bit about how sometimes we bemoan, new words. God, new words. The development of text speak, and how it used to be. It should still be like how it was used to be, but that's not really the way that languages work. Languages grow with us, and so as our world changes around us, our language is supposed to change with us. It is not supposed to stay static. And this has resulted in a remarkable turnover in the vocabulary of English. So in fact, more than 80% of the vocabulary used 1,000 years ago has been replaced with words borrowed since the Norman Conquest. 80%, that's pretty huge. Most of the words that we will be dealing with in this class are learned words. And so that means that their meanings are more likely to change a little bit in some way, but still be related to their root words. And so we'll be looking at a lot of words that are what we call cognates, or words which start out from the same root but merit separate dictionary entries. We'll be looking at a lot of cognates. Also, etymology is the study of words, how they develop their meanings, and the relationship between them. And so I'd like to conclude by looking at a series of cognates of the word disc or discus, which allow us to see sort of the range of ways that a word can be interpreted. So up at the top we have disc, which is actually from Old English, although it looks like modern English, and it originally meant dish. Disc, D-I-S-Q-U-E, was actually French, and it meant flat surface. And so then disc, or disc with a C or a K, came to mean specifically the flat surface of the sun, the moon, another planet. And then we have disc, D-I-S-C also, which came to mean a phonographic record in 1888. Discothèque, which was coined in French and then borrowed in 1951. And so we have our fun little minion dancing at the disco. This was shortened to disco in 1964. In 1979, we get the compact disc. And then, of course, with the advent of computers, we get the floppy disk, the disk drive, the diskette. And, of course, we have an image of a floppy disk here. I will admit that I'm curious as to how many of you have never seen one of those before. I remember them well from when I was a kid. Well, I guess even going into college, I had a great deal of them. And now they're so obsolete, it's not funny. In the 17th century, the word discus was actually borrowed directly from ancient Greek with its specialized athletic meaning. So we have there, a picture of a young lady getting ready to throw her discus. While I was searching for pictures of discus throwing, I discovered there is also a fish called the discus. It's the discus fish. And so I put a picture of the discus fish on here. And finally, we also have the word die, or raised platform, which is also related to that same original word disc. And so, as you can see, and this is of course not a comprehensive list of the cognates of the word disc or discus, but as you can see, the cognates, they all show traces of their origin. They all, if you think about it, you're like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. That's flat and round. Okay, the floppy disk isn't round, but it's flat. You know, it's a flat surface. But the semantic relationships can sometimes be complicated. But I promise you, they are usually there. If you have any questions, please email me or post on the discussion board. I will start a discussion for questions on this lecture. Next up, we will be dissecting words. Please don't confuse that with worms. That's a whole different class and not one I could teach or care to teach. And plus, I'm not much into the dissecting at all. So, sorry. Anyway, I hope that this has been an informative lecture, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards.